Hi everyone, welcome to Belle's Books. I'm Carly and today I am bringing you a very belated best books of 2022. Now if you've watched my previous video you will know that I had a bit of a weird reading year last year. If not, I will link it up in the cards and down in the description box below. But today I thought I would talk you through the best books that I read last year. Now these are not books that were published last year, they were just books that I read last year. I've got an odd list of 10 because I only read 31 books last year, which I think it was 31. So I read 8 non-fiction, 21 fiction. I only had one that I DNF'd on my Goodreads list, but there was a lot more than that because I started a lot of books in the latter part of the year that I didn't finish, that I didn't put on Goodreads. So I don't know how many of those there were. And there were 2 short story collections. Well, one was Gothic Tales by Elizabeth Gaskell, which I finished in January, and the other one was Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado, which I loved this, and this was going to be in my top 10. The only reason I didn't include it was because I read it a while ago, and the only story I can remember is the first one, The Husband's Ditch, which I'd read before. I find with short story collections that I really find it difficult to remember all the individual stories, but this gets an honourable mention because it was so good. I read one of the stories for a creative writing workshop I did, and I read the rest of the book for my book group, and I loved it. I would highly recommend these stories. I love her writing. It's magic realism, coming of age, feminism, queer amazingness. I just bloody love it. And erotic, very sexy. Yeah, good stuff. All good stuff in that one. So that's my one honourable mention. Now, let me start with the non-fiction. So I have 3 non-fiction books that are my top 3 for last year. One of them I don't have. No, 2 of them I don't have because they were library books. That's a lie. The first one was an ARC. It is, I'll place a picture here. It is Out of the Sun. This has 2 different titles that I can see. So Out of the Sun, Essays at the Crossroads of Race by Essia Dugin. That is probably my top non-fiction book of last year. So I read this as an ARC, and it is a collection of essays that are really seemingly disparate. So they're on very different subjects, but they all touch on race. And I love the writing in this. The writing is beautifully rendered. There is a mixture of kind of memoir and Essia Dugin's personal experiences, and it centers on each essay on very different things. So one of them is about art history, the figures that appear in certain paintings and the figures that don't appear in certain paintings. My favourite one was about ghost stories, the way we tell ghost stories. Again, who gets mentioned in ghost stories. She looks at specific locations, she goes travelling, so it's those particular places that she looks into the history and the narratives that are told around them, and the history of those people that we talk about and the people that we don't talk about, and how it informs our contemporary thinking and cultural consciousness. So I really adored it, and I really would like to go back and read it again. Like I say, it was an advanced copy, so I don't have a physical copy, but I really want to get my hands on one. So I would highly recommend it. The writing is beautiful as well. Love that very much. The next one I do have a copy of. It is Wintering. The Power of Rest and Retreat in Difficult Times by Catherine May. I read this at the beginning of the year. Actually, now I'm thinking about it, I should have also picked it up and reread it at the end of the year when I was going through my own very difficult time. This is about the concept of wintering, not just winter as in hibernation, slowing down, but also when you're going through a difficult time, it's okay to step back. And she looks at different ways of doing that. Again, it's kind of centered on location, so she goes to different places to look at how different cultures deal with this concept of wintering, and closing down and resting when you need to. She talks about wild swimming and swimming in the sea, which is something I now have first-hand experience of, because in December I went and got in the sea and it was the coldest I've ever been. Not sure I would recommend it, but there you go. She loves it. I really enjoyed this book at the time, and yeah, now I'm thinking about it, I'm like, why didn't I pick this up when I was going through my own difficult time? Because my brain was a mess, that's why. But I loved it. It wasn't kind of like advice, but it was just something to make you think. Lots of different ways to not look after yourself. It's not really like a self-help, but it's more kind of philosophical musings, and I really enjoyed that. So yeah, would highly recommend, and now I'm going to reread it. And the other non-fiction was a library book, and I don't have a copy. It was Wonderland by Ginny Ready. This is again not part memoir, but it's a travel book. So Ginny Ready goes around the British Isles looking for magic in the landscape. It's kind of prompted by an experience she has when she's like camping by herself on a mountain and she hears this voice, and it was kind of like a mystical, magical experience. Now I'm down for all of that. I love that stuff. So she searches the landscape, going from place to place, places that have significant like cultural value, like Glastonbury, looking for magic, and that is like tied to folklore and mythology in the landscape. So she goes to like these labyrinths, and it's just about her experiences. Also, she's coming from a place of mixed cultural heritage, and so when she's moving around these places, sometimes she gets confronted by people who, like, I don't know if it's actually said directly, but she has a feeling of like not belonging, but also belonging in this place, but being perceived as not belonging. So I found that a really interesting kind of counterweight to this like search for magic in the landscape. And there was a lot packed in that book, but it was also really cleverly dealt with. It's really easy to read. You're just kind of following her journey as she moves around these places. Sometimes she just gets nothing, and there's nothing here for me. I don't feel this. There's no kind of magic here. And other times it's like unexpected, and I really enjoyed that. I thought that was it was just very real. I really liked it. So it's not like massively magical, but yeah, I found it kind of really insightful. So again, and I would recommend all these books because they're my favourite. So would recommend it. So they're the three non-fictions. Now onto the fiction. At the very beginning of last year, I read A Sister Song by Lucy Holland, and that was amazing, and it's really stayed with me. So that was a story of three sisters. It's kind of based on an old like a murder ballad, old folk song, and it is going back again. It's a historical novel. It's kind of set at the time in old Saxon times, when people are living in these very small kind of villages, and they are very much connected to the landscape, and there's rooted in paganism and all of that kind of good old beliefs. And it's the time when Christianity is starting to take over, and people are coming in saying you can't practice that witchcraft anymore, it's a sin. So there's these three sisters, and they all have kind of their own kind of abilities, like almost magical powers, and it's them living with their father the king, and as kind of invasion is coming in, and they're dealing with like intrusions from outside, and also yes, this nasty old priest that's trying to make them convert to Christianity while they're fighting to carry on with what they know in their traditional beliefs. I really loved it, and it also follows the seasons, which I really enjoyed. So I started reading it in bulk, which is like the 1st, 2nd of February, which is just gone. So if you would be interested, I'd say pick it up now, because you can then read along with the seasons. It's very, very much kind of a seasonal book, and I love that. I just loved it. It was very magical, and I'm just here for historic fiction that's, you know, set in magical times. If you like kind of Arthurian legends, you would like this. So that is Sister Song by Lucy Holland. Then on my list, I have another library book that I don't have, but I would love to get a copy of. Drive Your Plough Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tokarczuk. I can never say that name. This was a book that really surprised me, and I didn't expect it to love it as much as I did, and I adored it. It is... I've immediately forgotten where it's set. It is about an elderly woman named Janina, and she is kind of very much a hermit. She keeps herself to herself. She looks after other people's houses, so that like she's living in an area where lots of people have holiday homes, summer houses, and she looks after them in the winter for these people that only come in the summer. And other times she is translating the poetry of William Blake and looking into astrology and being an animal rights activist, and she hates people. So I'm very much here for Janina as a character. I identified with her a lot. And she's got some people around her, like her neighbours, that she kind of knows, but she's not that bothered about being friends with. And then some people start to get killed, and she puts herself into the investigation, trying to work out what happened. And it is by turns bonkers and like part thriller or part mystery, because you're trying to work out what's happened, who's killing these people. But it's just so, like, I really loved it. I loved the characters. I loved the message. It wasn't too overdone. Like, there's a very strong theme of like animal rights and kind of anti-hunter sentiment, which I'm here for. But also kind of, again, part philosophical, musing on the importance of poetry and astrology and connecting with other people. And it was just a lovely, lovely book. It was just such an unexpected delight. I loved it very much. Okay, then a book I do have, but it's back there under the pile. I'm not getting it out. It's right at the bottom. It was The Vanishing Half by Brit Bennett. I'll put a picture here. I read this for my book club, I think, and I know I'm late to the party on this because everyone loves it. I loved it. What a surprise. If you don't know by now, it is the story of two twin sisters who are both kind of light-skinned, and they take two different directions. So one lives in a black community and one lives in a white community and passes for white. It is about their journey. So it starts in the 1950s, and it tracks both of their lives as they live separate lives, and their daughters' journeys. So one of the women marries a dark-skinned black man and has a child who is very dark, and the other woman has a light-skinned child, and they do kind of like intersect and cross over. And it was just fascinating and gripping and captivating. The writing was like on point. The story, the plot, everything was just like, if I could tell you that this was a perfect book, I'd go, this is as close to a perfect book as I could get. I just loved everything about it. I can't recommend it enough, but then most people did because it was all over BookTube when it all came out. So I'm just late. Okay, then a book that I got for my birthday, The Sentence by Louise Erdrich. Is it Erdrich or Erdrich? I'm not sure on the pronunciation, my bad. Again, I know there were mixed reviews on this, but I loved this. I loved it so much. So this is set in a bookshop. I always forget towns and places. Does it say? I can't remember. I want to say Minneapolis. Yes, Minneapolis. I got it right. It's set in a bookshop in Minneapolis, where one of the customers dies and is haunting the bookshop. Kind of starts off as that's a very loose premise for the book, but it's a very thin thread that comes through, because it's mostly centres on the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter protests, and big themes like that around these characters. These characters are also Native Americans, and it looks at cultural appropriation of Native American culture and a lot of things around that. But I just loved the characters so much. It was so well done. Tuki, who is our protagonist, was one of those characters where you kind of, I really loved her, but also she just made me mad with some decisions that she made. And yeah, I loved everything about it. I know people felt like it was a book of two halves, where it was the ghost story and then pandemic and Black Lives Matter kicked in, but I just thought it worked really well, and yeah, I didn't have a problem with that at all. I loved it very much. Okay, next up, another book I don't have because it was a library copy. It is The Dance Tree by Kieran Millwood Hargrave. This is set in Strasbourg, I remember that, in the summer of 1518, I think, when it was an extreme heat wave. Now, I read this in the summer, I think, and the heat just kind of seeps off of the pages of this book. It was so well described. We follow Lisbeth. She is heavily pregnant following lots of miscarriages, and she is worrying about her baby, worrying about carrying it to term, and her and her husband are living on a farm that is being threatened to be taken away from them. Her husband goes off to kind of fight their corner, and she is left with her mother-in-law and her sister-in-law, who has just arrived back from a very mysterious term away, being punished for something that Lisbeth doesn't know what it is. So you're kind of following her as she's trying to work out what happened to her sister-in-law, getting to know her sister-in-law and her friend Ida, and they all kind of go along together, and some stuff happens. I don't want to give any spoilers. There is a dancing plague. Now, I wanted more of this dancing plague. That's my only criticism of this book, that it's set at the time when there was lots of women took to the streets and just danced until they died, which is a fascinating concept to me. And it was how the people of Strasbourg dealt with it. One way was to invite musicians and let them dance themselves to death, which made no sense. But Lisbeth's story is centered around kind of this dancing plague and how the town are dealing with it. I did just want a little bit more, and for it to go into a bit more depth in looking into why that happened. But I also really enjoyed the story of these 3 or 4 women and their interactions. So trigger warning for child loss with that book, but it was beautifully written, and I loved it very much. Also, it'll make you really want to eat honey, because they keep bees, and there is like a lot of description about keeping bees and honey, and I had to go out to the shop and buy honey because it did a very good job of describing it. Okay, then we have When We Were Birds by Ayanna Lloyd Banwo. I read this at Halloween. It is a book about ghosts. We follow kind of 2 narratives of 2 characters that are like not related at all, and then they kind of converge and meet up towards the end of the book. So we follow Yejide, who is dealing with a very cool and absent mother who didn't give her much love, and she is kind of growing into this legacy of her family, where she has to take on this role that her mother has of like being able to kind of guide the dead and speak to the dead and move them on to the afterlife. And then we follow Darwin, who is a Rastafarian turned grave digger, and he uncovers some very shady goings on in this big cemetery that he's working at in Port Angeles. So this book is very much centered around the dead and the afterlife and legacies, cultural heritage. There is a very kind of nuanced and subtle take on colonialism, post-colonialism, but that's like, it's just kind of a theme that, like I say, is very subtle throughout the book. It's very much about these 2 characters and their interactions. Beautiful writing in here. It's a little bit in dialect, and I loved it so much. I really loved it. Also, this cover is beautiful, but this cover feels very summery, but actually because it's I think, I don't know whether because I read it at Halloween and it's very much centered around the dead, it just felt like quite a dark book, but in a good way. I loved it so very much. So I'm really pleased that I've found a new author that I can look forward to whatever she writes next. The last one is Woman Eating by Claire Coder. This is a vampire novel. that, again, I can't remember where it's set, but it follows Lydia, who is very hungry because she cannot source the pig's blood that she needs to live, because she's a vampire, but she doesn't want to eat people, so she classes herself as a vegetarian, much like Edward Cullen. But she's trying to find herself some pig's blood, some animal blood, so she doesn't have to eat people. And it's about her interactions with the people around her, like the people in her studio. She's an artist. It's very much kind of like a young girl. Like, I think that she's in her 20s, well, 20s for her being a vampire. And she's kind of deciding what she wants to do with her life. She's doing an internship at an art gallery where everyone's a bit of an arsehole. And she's an artist in her own right. She's making her own work, but there's like a little bit of self-doubt and imposter syndrome about her. It's about her interactions with other people. She feels like she can't interact with other people because most of her life she's been with her mother. Her mother is now in a home for elderly people, even though she's a vampire. And I found that really interesting, the kind of relationship between mother and daughter, which is quite strained. Like, her mother feels very needy and she wants to be with her daughter, and Lydia wants space from her, but her mother and that relationship is all she's ever known, so she really falters when it comes to relating to other people, knowing anything about being a vampire, because her mother didn't tell her much. She doesn't know any other vampires, and I found that really interesting commentary, because Lydia is also mixed race. She doesn't know much about like the Japanese side of her family. Her dad was a Japanese artist. So there's some really big themes in here, again, but dealt with so subtly and nuanced. It was a very clever book, and I found it like quite sparsely written and like very not in a bad way, but kind of cold. You're very much in her head. It's very insular about like her life and what she thinks, and she just feels so removed from everybody and so othered, whether that's through her own choosing or through the way that other people interact with her. I think it's one that I'd like to reread, and I don't often reread at all, so that is a big recommendation for Woman Eating. And also, it's really funny. There's some really funny parts in there where she's like desperate to eat something, but like doesn't want to eat the guy that she fancies. And just some really kind of like funny one-liners. So it was a very strange book, but I loved it a lot. Right, there you go. I've spoken for too long. Those are my top 10 books of 2022. Talk to me in the comments below if you've read any of them, and if any made your top books of 2022. I will be back soon with, I think I'm going to do a book haul, because I've had quite a few books that I got for Christmas and that I have acquired recently, so I think I'm going to do that, if that would be interesting to you. And I will see you very soon in another video. Bye everyone.